Hello, and welcome once again to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me on the program today. As always, I just want to give you a quick reminder that Just and Sinner is supported by donors, so we would ask that you would go to justandsinner.org. If you have benefited from the things that we do, you can donate. You can give a one-time donation or a regular donation to us, or you can just support us by purchasing the materials that we produce, our books and our seminars and other things that you can find available on the website. So we are today continuing our Makers of the Modern World series. And we've kind of bounced around a bit here, so I know some of you will be watching in the actual logical order. But as this is recorded, this is not immediately following the thinkers that come just prior to Thomas Hobbes. This is this has become a book that I am now writing, which has gotten the title "Makers of the Modern Mind" rather than the Modern World, because there were some misconceptions of what was going to be included in this book when I had initially used that title, but nonetheless, that's the title of the series here. So be on the lookout for that. It will be out in 2025. So today we are talking about Thomas Hobbes and the creation and the role of the state according to Thomas Hobbes. And so we have thus far in our story prior to Hobbes, we have looked at the early modern philosophers. We have looked at Descartes and Kant, as well as David Hume. And now we're moving into the realm of political philosophy or political thought. And so what we're looking at here is the birth of liberalism. Now, when I say liberalism, I am not just talking about left versus right in the sense that we tend to use the term liberalism today, where it's liberal versus conservative. What I'm talking about here is the liberal form of government. And we'll talk about exactly what that is here. But the focus is on some things like individual rights, the limitation of the powers of the state, the importance of the securing of freedom in liberal governments. And so the earlier political philosophies prior to Thomas Hobbes are quite different from what we find in the early modern era. And there are a lot of things that happen at this time that lead to the formation of what we call liberalism as a movement or an idea. So there are a lot of factors involved in this new political ideology that we are still living under within the Western world today. And so those factors are certainly not all just ideological ones. It's certainly not just a story of one thinker and another series of logical thought constructs. However, this series is focusing on those things. So I will not be able to cover everything here because our focus is on great thinkers rather than other world events that are happening that cause shifts. Okay, so let's start talking then about Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes, to be clear here, is not a liberal. We wouldn't characterize his philosophy today, as we'll see. We talk about his perception of the role of the state. It still is pretty foreign to us. However, what shows up in Thomas Hobbes is some of the major conceptions, shifts, questions, and ideas that start to form what is a liberal political philosophy. And so we're later going to look at John Locke, who is really the first liberal in the fullest sense that we tend to use that term today. But like anything else, movements don't just arise out of nowhere. They're usually a series of thinkers and considerations and ideas that tend to build one upon another. So I'm just going to set a little bit of context for the rise of liberalism here. Now, as I said, the focus here is not on culture, history, and the particular political situations going on here. So this is going to be really simplified solely for the purpose of understanding a little bit about the context in which the ideas of Thomas Hobbes arise. Well, the end of the medieval period sees a number of significant changes to the world. One of those is that militaries have grown significantly. So when you think about bureaucracies, a lot of people today complain a lot about bureaucracies in government, where you have all of these different, organizations that start to manage all different parts of the life of a state. And if you look at the medieval period, governments, well, you might think of them as being very powerful in the sense that you have, one king who has supreme authority in some ways. A king is not able to dictate everything that happens in a kingdom on like a day-to-day basis, because you have one person ruling, and it's not to say there's nobody else besides the king that's doing anything, but you don't have these giant kind of apparatuses that oversee the way that everything is done in every place in one's nation or empire or whatever it might be. And so those bureaucratic entities start to grow, especially toward the end of the Middle Ages. With that is a strengthening of armies and growth of military strength throughout much of Europe. And so there is a lot that is changing militarily, and just in terms of the expansion of the state by the time you get to the Reformation in the 16th century. Something else that starts to happen at this time is there is a developing sense of national identity in many parts of Europe. And in the medieval world, you don't really have nations in the sense that you think about them today. It's a bit more loose when you talk about a specific kind of national identity. You don't have what is called the nation state that develops in the early modern era. But there is this increasing focus on a national identity, things like a kind of solidification of national languages, like you see in Germany during the Reformation, for example. And Martin Luther sometimes is said to be a picture of this, or a great example of this kind of building of national identity. That was still not what you would consider nationalism, which is really a much newer phenomena. That takes some time to develop. So there are some questions that are raised about the consensus, about all sorts of things, and the way that the world was viewed and the way that Europe, Western Europe, had functioned. And one of those is we have the rise of the Renaissance, this rebirth of learning in the late medieval period. And with that comes the rise of humanism. Humanism is a movement that consists in a rebirth of learning as part of the Renaissance that focuses on textual sources. The humanists go to original sources. So instead of doing things like relying on some kind of maybe later source that summarizes the work of some ancient philosopher, the humanists are trying to go back and say, okay, let's look at the original sources. Ad fontes means back to the sources. That is the kind of rallying cry, they say, of the humanists during the age of the Renaissance. So they're doing things like actually learning other languages. They're not just relying on the commonly used Latin translations of texts. They're going back to Greek. They're going back to the Hebrew Old Testament. There is a re-engagement with a lot of texts from the classical eras of Greece and of Rome. And the effects of humanism were numerous, but one of the things that happened with this growth in learning is that some of the claims of the medieval papacy, and the claims of the medieval papacy were not just spiritual claims. So the Pope of the Middle Ages was, yes, the head of the church doctrinally, but it was also claimed that the Pope had these two swords. There was the spiritual and then there was the temporal, such that there was the temporal authority that was granted to the Pope. And as the office of the papacy was continually strengthened in its power throughout the medieval period, this strengthening of power coincided with a number of historical claims that the popes made, that there was some kind of right that the popes had of having temporal power. And there was a document called the Donation of Constantine, which was this supposed text written by the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, written to the Pope, where he basically dedicated a significant portion of the rule of his empire to the Pope, which was seen as this historical grounding for the political office or the political powers of the papacy. Now, that text had been questioned before in the Middle Ages by some, but it was often cited as a significant part of the argument that the Pope had this political or temporal power. So as the humanists read texts like this, and this is only one example, it's a prominent example, but it's not the only one, they start to say, well, this is clearly a forgery. Like, it doesn't have any signs of being written in the 4th century. It's very clearly a forgery. There's no historical veracity to any of this. And so the claims of the papacy, which really held Western Europe together at this time, politically and culturally, started to face some very serious challenges. And trust in the papacy also had waned significantly since the Great Papal Schism, where you had the Avignon papacy in France. You had two popes that were both competing for both claimed that they were the legitimate heir to the throne of Peter, and then you had a third pope, and then they were all deposed. So a number of things are happening politically as well that start to lead people to distrust the Roman Church in, yes, it's spiritual claims, but also in terms of temporal authority. There are also a lot of scientific discoveries that are going on at this time that start to cause people to rethink what they have believed about things in the world, start to rethink the way that the world functions. And these new scientific discoveries lead to new philosophical moves, and those new philosophical moves also lead to theological and political ones as well. The importance of this here is to say that when you had the popes critiquing the work of someone like Copernicus, Galileo, and the scientists were the ones that were clearly in the right, scientifically speaking, this just gave further impetus for a lot of people to say we can't really trust these church authorities, especially as they claim to be authorities not just in spiritual matters, but in all sorts of other matters as well. Now, this led to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation under Martin Luther. If you want to know more about the Reformation, you don't know anything, that's a lot of what's on this channel. So I'm a Lutheran theologian. So there's plenty of information that you can find here on that. But the Reformation really changed the shape of Europe, because now there are, with the Protestant Reformation, and this grows out of humanism, it grows out of the Renaissance, where there are challenges to the authority of the popes, and several historical documents start to get challenged. And you also have a challenging of the interpretation of texts that were used in the Middle Ages. As the more people learn the original languages, both Greek and Hebrew, but especially Greek, people start to question and challenge whether the translations and interpretations of certain passages that were used to defend various Roman claims, whether those were really accurate interpretations, or they were impositions on the text in order to support papal power and a number of other things. And so this then leads to a religiously divided Europe. I'm not going to get into all of the causes of the Reformation and who is to blame for these divides. I know Roman Catholic historians want to blame just Protestants for the divisions in Europe, and I think that's pretty unfair for a number of reasons, but we'll leave that aside for now. But the point is, now you have in Europe a number of different competing religious ideologies, and those religious ideologies are ones that define often the laws and observances of particular nations or territories. And because there's an understanding that the law of a state is so connected to religion, the religious and theological commitments of that state, you now have a number of princes who are competing, who are arguing for one, theological perspective over another theological perspective. And so the theological or religious battles that are happening in terms of doctrinal writing and doctrinal polemics are also having real political impacts. And so this is seen, for example, in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, which is ongoing during the time that Hobbes is writing. And there was also a civil war that breaks out in England over some of these, and not just strictly religious issues, but partially religious issues that Thomas Hobbes is living in the middle of. And so there's this question of religious toleration that people have to answer somehow. And it is, can we just live in this state of constant war all the time, where we have, this prince here is a Lutheran, and this prince here is a Roman Catholic, and this prince here is Reformed? How do we settle these disputes? And we're talking about inter-Christian princes or states here. We're not talking about other religions. And in the midst of this, there are questions of religious toleration. Should we have states that tolerate a certain number of faiths? If we do that, how far do we let that toleration extend? Or do we continue to just lay a heavy hand on various territories and claim that everyone in that territory has to submit specifically to this church? And what happens if people in that state, citizens of that state, then convert to something else? Do they have to leave and go somewhere else? Or do you just persecute heretics for forever? So these are real situations that everyone has to address. And so liberal political philosophy, I think sometimes there's a misperception of this in some of the post-liberal narratives that I hear today. Post-liberalism is a movement that tries to argue against the liberal order. And a lot of the arguments for post-liberalism arise from a lot of ideological concerns that we've got this move toward pure individualism that happens in the early modern era, and this is a serious anthropological problem. And I agree with that critique. It's an important critique, but it's not that liberalism just arises from a particular philosophy that just really wants to hold human autonomy at the center of itself. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen with some liberal philosophies, because it does. And you see some of that with Hobbes, but also liberalism just arises out of what is a practical reality of the question of, do we want to just continue living forever in a society where we're all just continually trying to kill each other to get citizens to go to one church or another? Are we just going to live with that forever? Can we live in this state of perpetual religious conflict and violence? I don't think anybody wants that. And so religious toleration really arises out of necessity, because it's unsustainable for a society to simply live in that constant conflict. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't other ways to resolve those conflicts, but the conflict had to be resolved somehow. It's simply a historical reality. Well, liberalism actually begins not just with Thomas Hobbes, actually, but with a guy named Hugo Grotius. Now, Grotius is someone who is not as well known. Students of maybe political theory might be familiar with Grotius. Students of theology might be familiar with him in terms of his theology. He was a remonstrant. He was an Arminian theologian. And Arminian theologians are those who raised, and remonstrants, those are those who had rebelled against the reigning Calvinism. And this, under John Calvin, a very strict kind of predestinarianism, there were a series of works written in opposition to certain elements of Calvin's doctrine of predestination, which then led to the formulation of what we think of today as the 5 points of Calvinism in response at the Synod of Dort. But Grotius here, we're not talking about him just in terms of his theology, or really his theology at all, though these two things are connected, but we're talking about his political theory. And so in 1625, now we're talking 7 years into the 30 Years' War here. So there's been a number of years of bloody religious conflict at this point. And of course, everybody's raising the question of, like, how do we resolve this? Like, how do we stop this? Can we just live like this forever? And so he writes this book called The Laws of War and Peace to try to resolve these issues. And in this book, Grotius attempts to use a Cartesian method of inquiry. And I have 2 programs on Descartes in this series, if you want to watch or listen to those to get an idea of Descartes' method. But essentially, the Cartesian method says that you strip away all of your assumptions about what you believe to be true, and then try to reason by first finding some kind of indisputable principle. So what is a principle that I'm not just assuming, I'm not just taking for granted? What is something that I can definitively prove to be the case, and then take that first principle and then reason from there? Okay, so Descartes does this with his cogito, his I think, therefore I am, which he believes is this indisputable principle of reason, that he knows that he exists because he has this thought experiment, and he couldn't possibly be thinking or doubting if he didn't exist. A thinking means that there is a thinker. And then he reasons toward the existence of God and the existence of the world and thinks from that point forward. So Grotius is trying to do something similar, but he's doing it in the realm of politics. And so he's asking the question, okay, through unaided reason, right, without using anything else except for pure reason. In other words, he's not looking at, like, scripture, even though he's engaged in theological debates. He's not looking at scripture and saying, okay, what does, say, Romans 13 mean about the purpose of government? He's just saying, by reason alone, apart from anything else, can I come to a logical conclusion about what the function or purpose of government is? And he believes that he has found that with this one fundamental issue, which is the right and necessity of self-preservation. And essentially he says, look, we've got all of these conflicting views of what the government should do, what the state should be, what laws should be, what theological commitments we should adhere to, and which ones we should reject. We have all of these different proposals about all sorts of things. And nobody is resolving these just by debate. And so this is what we're going to see in Hobbes as well, is both of them are looking at this and saying, okay, we see all these debates that are happening, people are writing all these theological texts, they're having arguments, but nobody seems to be convinced by the other side. It's not like you write one great argument in a theological text and all the people on the other side read it and they all say, oh, well, that was such a good argument, I can't refute it, and now we're all converting to the Lutheran Church. That would be great, but it doesn't happen. So he says, this isn't happening. This isn't being resolved by rational debate. But he says, well, can we find an underlying principle that is a kind of commonality underneath all of these different systems and proposals? And that's where he sees this indisputable principle. And so he says, everything else that we're saying about the state, everything else that people are saying about government, in some way assumes and flows out of this fundamental principle that people have a right to preserve themselves in their own lives and their own bodies. And so Grotius believes that this is a principle that was valid and true regardless of the validity of any Christian revelation. And again, Grotius is himself a Christian, as is like everybody that's involved in these debates. There's questions of how orthodox in terms of Christian commitment they are, but they all at least claim to be Christians of some kind. And so Grotius says, but even if that whole thing were wrong, this principle would still be the underlying principle. Well, then we get to this question of rights, because this preservation is couched under the category of rights. It's this idea that human people actually have a right to preserve themselves, a right to protect themselves, and to live their own life without interference in terms of bodily harm, not interference in any sense. Now, this idea of rights really takes some time to develop. We don't have a liberal conception of rights as we think of it until we get to John Locke, though it starts to slowly develop, beginning with Grotius here. Now, Grotius, in developing his idea of rights, rejects some older perspectives on the nature of the state and views of how it is that we discover the purpose of the state or the function of the state. He rejects the Aristotelian perspective based on teleology. Teleology meaning the end or the meaning or the purpose of something. Telos is the end or purpose. So a perspective based on teleology starts with the question of, okay, what exactly is the state for? What is any institution for? And then kind of reasons backwards to say, okay, well, if that's the purpose of it, how do we implement things that are going to kind of align with that goal or purpose? And in this Aristotelian view, there is some kind of general accepted common good. There is something that is viewed as the good of society, or a model of what a good society looks like. And that doesn't mean that you're going to achieve that perfection in terms of finding this perfect model of society. But if you have a goal or a view of what is a good society, then it gives you something to strive for and something to aim for and to direct your laws and institutions to. This perspective focuses a lot on personal virtue, this idea that human lives have a good end toward which they point. There is a telos or end or purpose in human actions and human character. And so as part of citizens of this common realm, which has a common goal or good, individual citizens also have this common or this good that is an individual good, which relates to that common good, but on a personal level, which we call virtue. So Grotius also shifts from classical views in that he does not argue for a basis in law that is in the transcendent order. And so classically, and by like the entire Christian tradition, it's going to be argued that human law has its basis in divine law. And so there is something that is eternal that human law is supposed to reflect. Now, the way that that's reflected is going to be different throughout different historical periods or different cultures, but the general underlying principles remain stable, and the underlying transcendent principles are unchanging. And he doesn't do that kind of rooting of secular order within an underlying sacred order. Now, the language of rights is not that prominent of a topic in like classical political philosophy. So you're not going to see a lot of talk about rights in Plato or Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas. And you are going to see the language used some, and people certainly talk about things like liberty or freedom as an element of the social order, but it's not couched in quite the same way. So older views tend to use the language of rights to talk about having a right to something, rather than a human being having just a bunch of inherent rights. So instead, it's you have a right to a certain thing, right? You have a right to your own wife. You have a right to your own kids or house. We have certain rights that are violated when someone takes something that is ours. So that's more the context in which the language of rights tends to show up in the medieval period. There certainly is not a classical tradition of grounding the entire political order, the entire legal order, on some abstraction that is called rights. This is really a novelty, this idea that the securing of rights is the purpose or goal of government. Now, for Grotius, he doesn't have a wide range of rights. He's really only talking about one, which is the right of self-preservation. That is really the sole goal or the sole purpose, principle that drives the state or the legal order. Now, Grotius believed that the view that he provides for here would be able to put an end to the 30 Years' War and these other religious conflicts, and would also provide an answer to the skeptics. And so there are skeptics that basically say, well, there is no basis of law. Like everything it's all just arbitrary. Montaigne kind of does this, where everything's just arbitrary. All you have is these magistrates that just kind of declare whatever the heck they want and determine that there is some divine order to things, and then people just have to obey it. So it's kind of really just this bare exercise of power, and there is nothing underneath that at all. And so Grotius is trying to say, we don't have to go this kind of nihilistic route and just say, well, there's no meaning or purpose or in anything, and it's all just arbitrary exercises of power. All right, then we get to Thomas Hobbes here. And I know it's kind of late by the time we're getting into the actual subject of Thomas Hobbes. But I think Grotius is such an important part of this because he's the one who sets up a lot of these principles that Hobbes is drawing on. And Hobbes is really usually credited for the things that really show up first in Grotius. So Thomas Hobbes, I'll try to do this quickly here. Biography, born April 5th, 1588 in Westport, England. He's the son of a vicar, a priest who was uneducated, seemingly, according to his testimony here. His father ended up getting into a physical altercation with some other clergy outside of his church, and then he got kicked out of the city of London after this. And his family moved in with Thomas Hobbes' uncle, who was wealthy. He was a glove manufacturer and had a small fortune, but enough to take care of the family. So Hobbes studied at Malmesbury School for his primary education. He then attended both Oxford and St. John's College at Cambridge. And while he was there, Thomas Hobbes became acquainted with scholastic philosophy and scholastic theology. And so he was well aware of the Aristotelian modes of thinking that we just talked about here. But he was seemingly never really fond of it. We don't get the idea that Thomas Hobbes was drawn to scholastic theology or philosophy and then rejected it at some point. It seems that he was never really convinced of the usefulness of those things. Hobbes also did encounter some Puritan theology as he was there as well. So he did encounter some alternate views which would have challenged some of those more classical Aristotelian perspectives, though of course the Puritans are a bit of a mixed bag in terms of those kinds of things. But certainly the Puritans would have challenged the supremacy of the monarchical order in England. In terms of his career, he spent a large portion or most of his career as a tutor to members of the Cavendish family, which was a noble family. The William Cavendish, one of the William Cavendishes, because there are several of them, who Hobbes works under. He dies of the plague, and then he leaves for Paris, and then he continues to work as a tutor under another Cavendish. I think it was a William Cavendish as well that he met there, part of the family. He ends up coming back to England in 1637, and you have this English Civil War that's happening, and he starts to write, really does write his most influential works while he is there after this point. And so what are those influential works? Well, here are his major works. The first is De Cive, which is on the Citizen, 1642. This is the first work where he really starts to extensively lay out his approach to the state. So many of the things that he talks about in Leviathan show up there already formed in that text, though not in as extensive detail as they're described in the Leviathan. So here he talks about issues of nature and the law. Is there a natural law? Or is there grounding in nature for civic law? He talks about what the purpose or role of the state is. Then he has this other work, which these three works are all connected. And so he writes this series that is about bodies. And this is supposed to be a broad philosophy. So even though Thomas Hobbes is known for his political writing, he saw himself as a much broader thinker than that, and he wrote on all sorts of different kinds of things. And so in De Corpore, he talks about philosophy as a study of bodies, which is kind of a strange way to view philosophy. But he says, well, we have a physical body, and so there's where the sciences are. And then we also have the civic body, which is the commonwealth or the state. And then he refers to essences or substances also as bodies, which is a very distinctive way of approaching metaphysics that's an intentional departure from Aristotle. I'm not going to focus on that for this talk here. And then De Homine in 1658, it's on humanity, on humans. And then we have the Leviathan, which is the major work that Hobbes is really known for today, 1651, and that's what we're going to be exploring a bit here. He also was a translator. He translated Thucydides and Homer, and I think he did some other smaller translations as well, but and his translations were pretty widely used at the time. Okay. So let's then talk about some of the basic concepts that show up within Thomas Hobbes' writing. And these basic concepts are mostly in the Leviathan. That's where I'm getting these from. But some of this is expanded upon in other works as well. But I'm really just using the Leviathan as my source text, just to be clear here. Well, Hobbes starts to make some moves which are going to really categorize most of political philosophy within that liberal tradition, at least in that kind of early modern era. And he comes up with this one idea called the state of nature, which is going to be very influential. We have people like John Locke, sorry, not Rousseau, but Rousseau talks about the social contract, which is what I'm thinking of here. But especially John Locke, who we're going to be looking at here. There are different conceptions of exactly what the state of nature is, and Hobbes and Locke differ a bit on that. So there's this broader shift that occurs in this discussion in Thomas Hobbes that we already saw here in Grotius. It's a shift in political philosophy away from the kinds of considerations that tended to dominate political discussions in the preceding world in the West. And so things like historical context, or really historical inheritance. Questions of, well, like, what has the government been? What are our rights? What are our traditions? What are the bodies that currently exist that have been handed to us that are governing? Questions about, legitimacy of a particular monarchy or noble family or something like that. Those questions tend to focus on history and inheritance. There is a shift in the modern world away from history in terms of what's been received toward theory. Second thing, we have a move away from questions of this common good, or this idea that there is this broader conception of what the good is, or that there is a good that is transcendent, meaning that there is a good that is beyond the physical world, toward which the physical world points, and in view of which the physical order should be properly constructed and ordered and directed. And we see a move away from divine revelation as giving us a conception of the state. So divine revelation, whether that is through just biblical, scriptural considerations and debates, or revelation in the Roman sense of this the tradition that's been handed down by the magisterium. Whatever conception of revelation you have, this is really a move away from those considerations as being primary to then more general rational questions about, well, what theoretically is the state, and then how do we implement that? So we have a kind of abstractifying of the political questions, and abstractifying of questions of meaning or purpose is found in the state, to start to just ask more questions about theory and then how to implement theory without so many historical or cultural or theological considerations. And so this kind of theoretical way of approaching government, like we just saw in Grotius, where he starts with this to find a rational principle that can be derived by reason alone without any other considerations, and then reasoning from there. He says it's very theoretical and abstract in the way that the state is considered. In this kind of abstraction that we find here in Hobbes, he starts with this theoretical state of nature. And the state of nature is essentially in some ways it's a thought exercise, but there's some different views on exactly whether Hobbes believes that the state of nature is a real historical time period or whether it's kind of just an abstracted theoretical thing. At times in reading Leviathan, it seems to me that he seems to think this was a real historical period, which is basically the state of nature is a time before the government existed. So it's a question of what would human society look like without the government? And so political philosophy then, in this view, arises from a consideration of what is human nature apart from the government, and then a consideration of, if that's how human nature is apart from the government, how does the government then interact with that or direct that in a proper way? And so now you're really in the realm of abstraction and theory. So Hobbes asks this question of, well, what would man be like apart from the state? Or it seems to me that he's saying, what was man like apart from the state? I think he really is constructing this real historical imagined time period where there is no government at all. And you could theoretically have a state of like pure bliss, that these human institutions just corrupt this kind of pure state that didn't have any law or anything like that. You see that kind of idealization in Rousseau of human nature and decrying of human institutions. Hobbes does not do that. He kind of does the opposite. And so for Hobbes, the state of nature, the state of man without a government, without law restraining him, is just complete chaos. And that chaos largely arises from conflict over things. Who owns what? And so basically, if you've got people you've got a limited number of resources and people need those resources, then people are naturally going to, in order to preserve their own lives, they're going to try to get those resources, and because they are limited by nature, they're going to be competing with other people in order to get those resources. And so what you have is then conflict. So conflict largely arises over wanting things or competing over things. So questions of who owns what. And the way that Hobbes sees humanity and sees the human psyche is that we are inherently self-interested. We are naturally we naturally are selfish. We naturally are concerned solely with what we want and not what would benefit anybody else. And so that is going to drive our actions. And so if there is a threat to our bodies or what might be good for us, we are going to basically do anything in our power in order to stop that threat, including acts of violence toward other people. Hobbes describes this state of nature very famously as poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Another phrase that's often cited here that Hobbes uses is that the state of nature is all against all. Everybody is against everybody because we all want the same things. We're all fighting for the same resources, and there are just no boundaries at all. And we are all just going to try to destroy one another. And so this state of self-interested conflict then means that in the state of nature, there can be no industry, there is no human creativity, there is no art, there is no culture, there are no institutions. And so naturally, because we are so selfish, we are not going to cooperate with other people in order to accomplish anything at all. It is only in the existence of the state and under the magistrate that such things are possible. And this gets to just general questions about human nature. And so you might hear this and think, well, all of that kind of sounds similar, say, to the Christian doctrine of original sin. This perception within Christian theology that we believe that human beings are fallen. Human beings by nature, because of the sin of Adam, are selfish. St. Augustine uses the phrase that we are incurvatus se, we are curved in on ourselves. We look for our own needs, our own desires, our own wants, rather than those of other people around us. And so, we may say, well, Hobbes just kind of sounds like he's in that general Augustinian Western theological tradition, just like most Christians at this time in the Western world would be as well. But he is not just saying that. He is saying something more than that. And so he differs from the Christian conception of original sin in a couple ways. And I would say that in some way he's more pessimistic than Christians are about even the effects of the fall. But in some ways he's also much more optimistic. So what the heck do I mean by that? Well, the place where I think he is a bit more pessimistic is that he sees humanity and human beings as primarily individuals, rather than these collective units. And I know collective sounds weird because you've got collectivism, which is kind of something else, but maybe community is probably a better word. And so he's not thinking of humans as being inherently interconnected by nature, such that human community exists because that's just the way in which humans function. That's part of how humans are created. And so we have to work communally to some degree. We have to work in collaboration and cooperation with other people. That's just inherent to who we are. And so for Hobbes, that's not really natural to human people at all. He would instead say that any kind of cooperative system at all has to be kind of imposed rather than something that comes from the ground up that's inherent to humanity. So without this imposition from the state of creating this any kind of peace, we are not going to live in community with other people in any way. So here you see that Hobbes, and this is part of a broader shift you see in a lot of Enlightenment thought, is that there is this centralizing of the individual will. And for Hobbes, the will or free actions of the individual really become definitional to what personhood is. And so the human person is, definitionally one who has a will. The human is definitionally one who is free. And it's for this reason that you have this competitive vision that lies at the heart of what humanity is, because we as people are defined primarily as these individual free wills who come into conflict with other individual free wills, which then creates this division. And it's largely because of this division of people and view of people as wills that for Hobbes, the common good is not really a possibility, because there is no possibility of these distinctive free, self-willing things coming together really for some common good or purpose. So in some ways, he never really sees that we can even get out of that selfish mode. It's not like he is speaking about, sin and redemption or something, where you can get out of that kind of selfish mode. He just says this is just kind of the way people are. This is the way that they operate. And so if you view people as these primarily self-interested, self-centered individuals who are defined largely by their own willing, that's going to have an impact on how you view society, in terms of how you view all sorts of things, but society being the topic under discussion here. So people are inherently selfish largely due to this inner impulse that we have, and here he's drawing from Grotius again. There's this inner impulse that we have to preserve our lives. And so, as a human person, of course I want my life to extend. Of course I don't want to die. When there are dangers to my life physically, I will do what I can to fend off those dangers. These are just natural human instincts and impulses. And this then is what creates selfishness. Because my selfishness really arises out of what is my primary desire and that great inner psychological impulse to preserve my bodily life. And then here is where he's actually pretty optimistic about human nature in some other ways, which is, he says, well, if life is preserved, then people are generally not that selfish and will kind of leave each other alone. Now, to be clear, when he says not that selfish, what he's not saying is then we're just caring and loving toward other people. He's not really talking about that, but it's more this idea of leaving each other alone, as if, like, kind of, if you don't threaten me, I won't threaten you. So if you're not a danger to me, I have no reason to dislike you or attack you. It's not because there's some kind of genuine goodness within a person that they actually want to just live in some kind of community of self-giving for the sake of another person. We live with other people, or we collaborate with other people. We operate within the realm of other people, but we ultimately do that for, selfish reasons. And we're going to leave other people alone just because we don't see them threatening us, and there's no reason not to leave them alone. And he's also optimistic in his view of emotion, or the passions, really, which isn't identical with emotion. But so within classical philosophy and within then traditional Christian theology, it is argued that reason is superior to the passions. So the idea is that we have these inner desires, passions, things that we just kind of want. And that could be emotions, but it could be things like the desire for bodily needs as well. So we could talk about things like hunger, and so for classical philosophy and again Christian theology, there is this directing nature of reason, so that reason governs the passions, and so that if we're properly functioning, a properly ordered life is one in which you don't just simply give in to whatever you feel, and so you don't just say, well, I'm really hungry, so I'm just going to eat 3 pizzas because I feel like it. Instead, you're going to use your reason to say, okay, I am hungry, but then you use your reason to say, is it a good idea to eat 3 pizzas? Would that benefit me? And then you use your reason to come to the conclusion that probably would not be the best thing to do. So maybe you will just, eat less pizza, or perhaps you will order something else or make something else that is healthier for you, whatever it might be. And so it is the view of classical philosophy in general that, like, emotion or inner bodily desires, impulses, those kinds of things are not generally very reliable guides at all, and we cannot rely on them and should not rely on them in terms of our decision making. But we need to think through things before we do them. And so Hobbes challenges that, and that's something that is going to be challenged by a number of the post-structuralist thinkers like Derrida and Foucault much later on. So there's a lot of religious conflict, as I said, that is going on here at this time. And this religious conflict is largely what leads Hobbes to the conclusions that he does, especially in this conception of rights that we're just going to look at in a minute here. And I've already mentioned a little bit of it in terms of the 30 Years' War, but Hobbes is living in England here. And just quickly overview some of this. The English Civil War is 1642 to 1651. And this is part of a series of multiple conflicts that are going on in England at this time, which precede this as well. But really, ever since the Reformation itself, in England, you have a series of conflicts over 2 primary questions. One of those is the nature of parliamentary power versus monarchical power, how much power should be granted to the king versus how much power rests in the parliament. And then you have the connected conflict of the nature of worship in the church. And there are the Puritans, who are of the kind of the low church variety, who are also supportive of diminishing monarchical power, who tend to see both religious and political power as consisting more so in a system of balances between multiple people. Whereas you have those who are the high church types, who are the Anglicans, later called the Anglo-Catholics. That's not a historic term here. But those who prize history, those who want a strong episcopacy, who believe that a lot of power and authority rests in the bishops. And those same people tend to be very strongly supportive of the monarchy and the power that is invested in the monarchy. So these are really questions of structures of power that are related to one another in both the church and the state in England that lead to a lot of these conflicts. Now, like Grotius, Hobbes recognizes that there are these kind of inevitabilities in conflicts when you are dealing with competing conceptions of the good. And this may sound kind of odd because you have a bunch of different Christian groups that their conceptions of the good are pretty similar in a lot of really significant ways. But certainly with the Roman Church, you have papal primacy, papal supremacy, that again has both theological and political dimensions, that is part of that conception of what a proper society is or what orders the common good, that is distinct from any Protestant conception, whatever variety you're talking about, but really you're just talking about the Lutherans and the Reformed and the Roman Catholics, and that's pretty much it. Or in England, you have the Anglicans, and Anglicans really are a group that kind of have a mix of all of those groups in some ways within the Anglican communion. But you have these competing conceptions of what the good is, and there are a number of academic disputations at this time. People are writing massive theological texts. I mean, this is really what I read most of the time is 17th century theological writings, which are writings that contend for various doctrinal commitments in each of these different traditions, the three that I just outlined primarily. And Hobbes recognizes that, there are a lot of disputations happening and a lot of really smart people writing really, really big books and really large sets of books and studying history and studying scripture and studying philosophy. They're all very intelligent people, very well-educated people that make good arguments for their positions. And ultimately, they're not going to come to a consensus. They haven't done so yet, and most likely they will not ever come to a consensus. And it is true that the 17th century was the century where you have the most extensive theological defenses of every position. And that's true. Now maybe things are more accessible. You can go on YouTube and watch things, but the level of disputation was so much higher in the 17th century than it was ever before and has been since. And it didn't resolve the issue. So that's what Hobbes is getting at here. Is the issues still aren't resolved, and so this kind of absolute moral consensus is very unlikely to arise just among citizens in themselves. If it's just driven by free inquiry and academic disputation. And so people are swayed by all sorts of things. And Hobbes is going to recognize that people are very often swayed by emotions or were manipulated. People are not these just pure rational machines who can come to these perfectly reasonable conclusions. We're often driven by some pretty arbitrary impulses to do what we do or think what we think. And so Hobbes is pretty skeptical of the abilities of reason to arrive at definitive conclusions, which is kind of odd because this whole experiment starts with coming to a definitive conclusion about the purpose of the state. But the thing is, he's finding one definitive conclusion, right? So he's saying we can. It's a very different thing to say we can arrive at some underlying principle that he thinks we all really agree on, rather than trying to definitively determine which church is correct or something like that. But this leads to a problem because common language and moral standards are necessary for a civil society. And so Hobbes doesn't believe that ritual doesn't matter or that societal institutions don't matter. He's not arguing that. He knows that they're actually really essential, that there is a sense of ordered religious life that is necessary for the preservation of society. And so the question is, how do we have a conception of the common good or a conception of common religion or anything like that if people can't come to agreement on anything? If debate isn't resolving anything, how the heck do we resolve it? Or is there any possible way to resolve it? And so he essentially says if they can't be achieved through this mutual conversation, through intellectual debate, through free inquiry, they can be imposed from somewhere else. And so for Hobbes, these things are then imposed by the sovereign. In other words, the head of the state. The state basically just determines, here's your religion, and I'm telling you what it is, and you all have to submit to it. that is Hobbes' conception, which is going to then resolve the conflict, because then at least it's all just up to the magistrate. And as a citizen, you don't really have to worry about it too much. Now, in terms of the question of rights, Hobbes doesn't really go that far beyond Grotius. And so he doesn't have a developed conception of rights. By developed, I mean he doesn't have a Lockean conception where there are numerous rights. Instead, there's really just one singular right, which is the right of self-preservation. And so that really is the sole right. There is the right of self-preservation. So that means that nothing should be claimed as a right which doesn't contribute to this. So Hobbes is not talking about the kind of totally free and autonomous person that develops much later. This idea that you have a right to do absolutely anything you want to your own body, right? The right of bodily autonomy or something like that. Hobbes does not affirm anything like that. So if you were to, use harmful substances that are going to hurt your body, you would not have a right to do that because that's like the opposite of the fundamental right, which is self-preservation. And so you don't have a right to do things which are going to harm your own self-preservation or the preservation of other people in maintaining that same right. And so if there is any good in society or conception of a common good, it really arises from this principle. So if there is a common purpose of the state, it really is to protect the right of self-preservation. And that really is the sole function or purpose of the state. The other things the state does are really just outgrowths of that. And for Hobbes, as he looks at religiously divided England, religiously divided Germany, and other parts of Europe at this time, as he looks at these various conflicting ideologies, he says that really underneath all of these ethical, religious, philosophical fluctuations that move back and forth. Sometimes the same person goes back and forth a bunch of times about all sorts of things. Still happens today. Underneath all of that, there is this underlying principle, which is that there is this internal desire to preserve one's own self. And so if that lies underneath the fluctuations, if it's like the only unchanging thing underneath them, then that means that it's something that's more sustainable than the fluctuating theological commitments of a person or group of people. And so Hobbes says people are easily manipulated, as I mentioned, and they're manipulated into changing their philosophical or religious views all the time. I see this all the time with people who are just bouncing back and forth between one thing and another. But people aren't as easily manipulated to give up this right of self-preservation. So it seems to be more beyond manipulation than you see with these other things. Well, this then leads to the idea of the social contract. The state, for Hobbes, is formed as a contract that is made between individuals, and everything goes back to really the centrality of the individual will. And so a number of individuals in the state of nature come together and they realize that it is in their best interest, not the best interest of others, because that doesn't matter. It is in their best interest to create a contractual arrangement that is going to protect their lives, and it will also consequently protect the lives of the other people who are involved in this contractual arrangement. So it's a mutually beneficial agreement. And so government, or the legitimacy of government, does not come from any divine source. And so that's why I say authority is not delegated. Authority is delegated by the people to the magistrate, but it is not received from above. Right? So God does not give a divine stamp of approval to the leaders of a state. So there is no divine authority that is underlying human political authority. Instead, human political authority is simply handed to certain people by means of a contract. And so the social contract, the ultimate goal is that people stop hurting each other, which preserves lives. It's based on compromise, and so it's recognized that in order to preserve your life, you're going to have to compromise, because in order to preserve your life, you're going to have to make an agreement to say, okay, well, my life will be preserved, and in turn, if you don't hurt me, I won't go steal your chickens. You're going to have to make these arrangements where if you don't want someone to do something to you, you're also going to have to make an agreement that you're not going to do the same thing to them. And so it benefits everybody that you agree to all of these things. Okay. And so it's this social contract that then creates the state. It's based on compromise and the right of private judgment. And this is really important here. The right of private judgment is essentially given up and handed to somebody else, because it's private judgment that's caused all these religious conflicts in the first place. Everybody says that, well, they've studied and they see the historical evidence of that the papacy is valid, and another group says they look at the historical evidence, say the papacy is not a historical institution and it's not valid, and someone says that Scripture teaches this, someone says that. So these are all issues of private judgment. I know Rome likes to say, like Roman Catholics like to say, well, we gave up private judgment when we submitted to the Pope. And yes, but you also need to use private judgment to determine if the Pope's claims are valid or not. There's private judgment in all of this. We all have to deal with private judgment in some way. And so Hobbes says, well, we just give that up altogether for the sake of preserving our ultimate right, which is to preserve our own lives. And so we say, all right, I'm not going to privately determine what's right or wrong. I just give that to the state, and they tell me, and I believe whatever they tell me. That's fine. And it's in my best interest because it protects my life, which is really all that really matters. And so then we have, with the social contract, Hobbes says there are two different realities created. We have the commonwealth, which is the people, those who are living in mutual agreement to be at peace. And then we have also, this consequently creates a sovereign, because this contract needs someone to actually delegate authority and judgment to. And that becomes the individual who is in charge of the state. And so if this individual who is in charge now is enforcing the contract, if that's being enacted, then the right to self-preservation is no longer threatened. And because Hobbes has said, well, people generally are just going to leave each other alone, that's the nature of humanity, as long as they're not threatened, then it's going to achieve peace. Because if there's some external force that's preserving your life, you really have no reason to go attack or hurt anybody else. Okay. This leads to, I think, a dilemma really for Hobbes, which is the question of well, why keep the contract? Because, he's made the argument that within the state of nature, people deceive each other all the time. People just harm each other, and they don't really have seemingly any concern for who they deceive or who they harm or who they hurt, as long as they get what they want in order to perpetuate their own life. If people really are so selfish by nature in this way, and if people are willing to deceive others or lie so much without any concern, why is anyone bound to keep the contract? Right? Why is anybody keeping the contract at all? Why does anybody trust anyone else to keep this contract? Because in any situation, I'm sure you can imagine that there are times where your life might be better preserved by not doing what the magistrate says or not keeping your end of the contract. So you might say you're keeping your end of the contract, but you might in the middle of the night, go and steal your neighbor's chickens because you still want more food. Why wouldn't that happen? Why is it that anybody is trusted at all? Why does anybody trust anybody else's word to actually keep this contract in place? And Hobbes' answer is part of his anthropological conception here, which is just, well, if somebody keeps their end of the bargain, you're probably going to do it too, as long as you're not directly threatened. But what about the first person? There's just this kind of maybe mutual trust in each other, but where does the mutual trust exactly come from? So John Locke is going to deal with this question. And he proposes that there is a necessity in a theistic belief. There's a necessity in belief in God for all citizens. Because he says, well, there isn't, if all there is the temporal order, and people don't really care about deceiving each other, there is no reason to trust anybody to keep their end of the bargain at all. So Locke says, well, you have to have a conception of deity. And so you have to believe in God in some sense, because if you have a conception of God, that God cares about you keeping your word, and there might be eternal consequences for you not keeping your end of the bargain. And so that kind of gives impetus for people to actually stick to their word, which is why Locke argues that atheists should all be exiled. That is his argument. And that's the reason why. It's because of civic order. He doesn't believe that atheists can keep civic order because of that. All right, well, now we have the final section here, which is the role of the sovereign. And so we've talked about the creation of the state, the nature of the state, how it's created out of this conception of human freedom and compromise and this fundamental right to preservation. But what does this actually mean for the sovereign? Because we've talked all about this book called The Leviathan, but we haven't even discussed what's in the title, the Leviathan, because the Leviathan is the sovereign, the state, the one who rules. And the name Leviathan, comes from this beast in the Bible. And so it evokes this image that you have this kind of powerful beast that is the state, that is a necessary exercise of power in order to preserve people's lives. So it's the role of the sovereign to keep the commonwealth in order, to make sure that life is preserved and people don't just devolve once again into this state of nature. So what we see here in the conception of government is not a liberal order, right? And this is probably the part where Hobbes most obviously is not aligned with the later liberal order. But he is in some ways, actually. But what you hear probably sounds like, well, this sounds more like some kind of tyrannical state. But he actually does put limits on the state, as much as it's this like Leviathan. There are pretty significant limits on what its role really is. And so this isn't a moderated system of checks and balances. We don't have what we have in like the founding fathers of the United States. We don't have this concern to make sure that the sovereign's power is moderated by other powers. It's really a centralized perception of power here. And this power is, in some ways at least, it seems to be nearly absolute in Hobbes's rendering, as long as self-preservation is retained. Now, that is actually a significant limitation, because sometimes in Hobbes's writing, it sounds as if the power is absolute, but self-preservation is still pretty broad in terms of what Hobbes is defining as self-preservation, and it really does limit the power of the Leviathan to a significant degree in terms of like taking property and making sure that people have enough food and those kind of things. So the sovereign is motivated by self-preservation too. That's what the human psyche does. So it should be assumed that everybody's motivated purely out of self-preservation. There's nothing else going on. So the sovereign is not motivated by the love for the people that he protects. He's not guided by a sense of duty. He's not guided by a sense of wanting the best for his people. He's just guided by the same instinct of the preservation of life that everybody else is. And so what that means is that the decisions that the sovereign makes are going to be for his own benefit. And so he's not going to rule for the benefit of other people. He's just going to rule for the benefit of himself, because that's just how people are. Kind of a depressing approach. But looking at the political world, and not just like now or in this country, just in general, it's probably kind of accurate with most political rulers. But what he argues is that's not necessarily a bad thing, that the government, the magistrate is guided by self-preservation, because it is going to be in the best interest of self-preservation, that the sovereign makes good decisions that are going to benefit citizens. And so it's not in the sovereign's best interest to make decisions that are going to be harmful to the people, to the commonwealth, to like tax people into oblivion. And that kind of thing is ultimately going to threaten the life of the magistrate, because if you abuse your people too much, your people are going to hate you, and there is a good chance of you getting overthrown and killed. So you don't want that. And so the magistrate is then really forced, for a selfish reason, to do something that is for the good of others. And so there is then motive for the sovereign not to abuse power. There is then motive for the sovereign to give relative freedom to subjects and limit the exercise of his power insofar as it keeps the people in the Commonwealth relatively happy. And so the overthrow of the state is less likely. There is a necessity in private property for Hobbes, and so you do see that. And this is pretty distinct from a number of medieval conceptions of property, where within a feudal system, many have the perception that there really is no private property per se, that property really belongs to the emperor and is kind of lend it out essentially to others. So there is a conception of private property that you find in Thomas Hobbes here. And essentially he says, well, in order to preserve your own life, like you need to be able to exercise freedom to some degree. You need to have some of your own stuff. If you don't have any sovereignty over your own stuff, you're going to end up in that state of wanting what other people have. Because remember, all of this goes back to the desire for resources when you have limited resources. So if you have limited resources and too many people that want them, right, you've got this fighting. But private property is necessary because that says you have your own resources. They are yours, and the state secures them as yours so that you're not trying to take those of other people. So private property is a necessity here. So that's a bit of an expansion of that principle of right to something that's broader than that. And there is, though, also some possibility that Hobbes talks about of a redistribution of wealth. Now, this redistribution of wealth is not absolute. Hobbes is not some like proto-Marxist or something. He's not talking about redistribution of wealth in like a pure socialist sense, at least. But he says in times of like famine, so in times where people's lives are threatened, those are times when the sovereign should have some kind of distribution of wealth or food in order to preserve the lives of those citizens whose lives would not otherwise be preserved. So the goal is not this like complete egalitarian society where everybody has exactly the same amount of stuff. But the goal is that everybody has enough that they feel satisfied and that their lives are not being threatened. So the state has to make sure that people have the kind of bare minimum to survive. And the magistrate's duty is to do that because, again, if they don't have that, the people are probably going to get pretty upset with the magistrate and then may overthrow him. So it's in his best interest that he distributes or makes sure that there is enough wealth for people to continue to at least, have a place to sleep and have enough food to survive. The sovereign is basically given absolute authority over doctrine. And so Hobbes wants to avoid the religious conflicts of these other nations, but not by going to like a centralized authority like the Pope, where, you could do that, right? Roman Catholics do that, which is to say, well, we don't really have to have private judgment because we can just give it to this guy, right? And Hobbes does not do that. He doesn't say, therefore, we should submit to the Pope, and you don't have to worry about the whole doctrine thing. Let him decide it for you. Instead, he's like, well, you actually give that to the sovereign. That's because the fights were between Protestants and Catholics, so the Pope wasn't really exactly seen as a solution to any of these issues. That was kind of the root of these issues. So he said, well, what about the sovereign? Let's just give him power. You've given up your right of private judgment. The sovereign just says, this is the religion of the people, and everybody just says, okay. And now you have some kind of common good, common rituals, religion, calendar, all those kind of things that a society needs, but it's all determined by the sovereign, and you don't have to worry about it as long as your life is preserved. I don't think anybody wants that. I mean, who wants that? So probably not the most appealing solution to people today. Theologically, certainly a lot of issues there. And the final issue then that we come to is the question of resistance. And this is one that we're going to pick up again when we look at Locke. Actually, we're going to pick up almost all of these issues when we look at Locke. But John Locke's, two treatises on government, which are like foundational texts for the liberal order. Locke writes in order to address this question of like, when is resistance to the state justified? And Locke gives an answer, and an answer that is quite tenuous, really, that allows for resistance in almost any circumstance, just as long as one determines that you're in that circumstance. I don't think he really has any clear boundaries around what constitutes resistance and justified resistance, but we'll get there. But for Hobbes, it's pretty straightforward, which is you're never allowed to resist the sovereign unless the contract is broken. And unlike Locke, Hobbes is clear about when the contract is broken, because the contract is broken when your life isn't being preserved. Like it's only if the sovereign says, well, I'm not going to preserve your life anymore. If the sovereign says, we have no laws around theft anymore, people can come steal your stuff and whatever. Or the sovereign just starts randomly executing people for no reason, like those kinds of things. It's only in those very specific circumstances in which the contract was broken, and then the sovereign can be resisted or overthrown. But there has to be a threat of there has to be the possibility of this circumstance, because if it's not a possibility and submission to the sovereign is totally absolute, then there's nothing motivating the sovereign to act justly. The sovereign only acts justly because of this being a perpetual threat. But the threat is in very specific circumstances that such a thing could be justified. And this is an issue that is going to cause a lot of problems as we move forward in political philosophy, is if the state is really just determined by a contract and there's nothing transcendent or eternal grounding that authority at all, the authority is not like real, right? It's handed to somebody, but if it's just a contract, like, it's pretty easily broken, and there becomes an increasing ambiguity in terms of what means, like, what do you do that breaks the contract? Like, what kind of thing or action that you might take actually violates the contract? Like, if the contract, say, in the United States is the U.S. Constitution, I mean, I could look at every single president in the last, 60 years at least, and see some way that they have violated the Constitution and have gone beyond the duties that have actually been delegated to them. It happens constantly and it's all ignored. But does that mean that there's always, it's always acceptable to overthrow the magistrate? Like, theoretically, could we have had a revolution because a president, acts unconstitutionally in one way or another? And you can make that really broad and justify pretty much any revolution you want. So that becomes a major issue that I think we're still really reckoning with today. Well, I hope you found this interesting and helpful here. Hobbes is he's an interesting figure. I actually enjoyed reading Hobbes. He's not too difficult to understand if you want to delve into Leviathan yourself, but it's a huge book. So if you do it, I'd recommend finding like a guide of like what are the important sections to read, because it's so massive that it's a bit daunting, and I'm not really sure that the whole book is totally worth reading for most people, but I don't know. You can if you want. Well, thanks so much. If you do want to look at more political philosophy stuff, I would recommend taking a look at the series of videos I have on Friedrich Julius Stahl, who is a Lutheran political philosopher who I really like, and I think provides a lot of resolutions to some of the issues that we see being addressed and then deepened here with Hobbes and then Locke and then some others after him. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and the podcast, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.